You can classify each type of electrical load connected to a panel. These classifications are called load classification types. When you insert an element into a Revit model that needs power, it must have an electrical connector. These electrical connectors will have a reference to a load classification. You can also specify demand factors and assign them to corresponding load classifications that are then assigned to the electrical connectors. You can access the load classifications and demand factors settings in a couple different ways. They appear in the Electrical Settings dialog, which can be accessed by clicking the dialog launcher on the electrical panel of the Systems ribbon. In this dialog, when you click on the Load Calculations settings, two buttons appear: Load Classifications and Demand Factors. These buttons open the associated settings. I'll click Cancel to close this dialog. Also, on the Manage ribbon, in the Settings panel, when you expand the MEP Settings drop-down, you can choose Load Classifications and Demand Factors. Click Load Classifications to open the Load Classifications dialog. In this list on the left, you can see the load classification types that are created in the project. As you can see, Revit provides several types by default. When you select a load classification type in the list on the left, the parameters populate on the right. For each type, you can see the name, demand factor, and the selected load class for use with spaces. The available load classes are None, Lighting, and Power. When you expand the demand factor drop-down, you can see all of the available demand factors in the project. If you need to create a new load classification type, you can click New to create a new type, or Duplicate if you want to create a new type based on an existing type. You can also select a type and choose Rename or Delete if you no longer want that load classification type in the project. You can use demand factors to adjust the rating of the main service for a building based on the expectation that at any given time, not all of the electrical equipment will be drawing at the full rated load. Typically, building codes determine what values to use for demand loads. In order to access the Demand Factors dialog, you can click the button next to Demand Factor. In this list on the left, you can see the demand factor types that are created in the project. Once again, Revit provides several types by default. When you select a demand factor type in the list on the left, the parameters populate on the right. For each type, you can see the name, calculation method, and calculation options. The calculation options are different depending on the calculation method. For example, when I select demand factor in the list, the calculation method is set to constant. Under calculation options, there is a field to specify the constant demand factor. Also, there is an option to add an additional load to the calculated result. Now I'll select electric clothes dryer in the list of demand factor types. The calculation method for this type is set to by quantity. Under calculation options, there are two radio buttons, total at 1% and incrementally for each range. Then there is a table to specify the quantity range and demand factors. In the greater than column, you can specify the lower limit of a range of objects. In the less than or equal to column, specify the upper limit of a range of objects. Then the demand factor percentage specifies the percentage of the full rated load that will exist at any given time for the specified connected objects. You can also use the Split the Selected Row and Delete the Selected Row buttons to complete this table as needed. These commands allow you to specify several quantity ranges for connected objects. Then, you can apply a different demand factor to each range, or apply the same demand factor to all objects, depending on how many objects are connected. Next, I'll select the receptacle type. The calculation method for this type is set to by load. Once again, the two radio buttons are available, along with a table to specify the demand factor for various load ranges. In the greater than column, you can specify the lower limit of a range of loads. In the less than or equal to column, specify the upper limit of a range of loads. Then the demand factor percentage specifies the percentage of the full rated load that will exist at any given time for a specified range. So as you can see, for demand factor types, the calculation method can be constant, by quantity, or by load. Under the demand factor types list, you can use the new and duplicate buttons to create new demand factors as needed. You can also rename and delete types as necessary. I'll click Cancel to close the dialog. Since creating load classification and demand factor types can be time-consuming, you should create the types and save them as part of your company's project templates. I'll click Cancel to close the Load Classifications dialog. Next, on the Systems ribbon, in the Electrical panel, I'll click Electrical Equipment. In the Type selector, I'll choose a transformer and then click to place an instance of the equipment. Then I'll click Modify to end the command. Now I'll select the transformer and click Edit Type in the Properties palette to open the Type Properties dialog. In the Electrical section, you can see the Load Classification parameter. When you click in this field and click the adjacent button, the Load Classifications dialog opens for you to specify the load classification.